Another way that Canadians should know is the gift of appreciated public securities. It's a real tax advantageous way for folks to give, and particularly comes into play when folks are thinking about larger transactions.
Welcome, Anil, to the Steadyhand Coffee Break series. It's great to have you back.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Now, in the first video on philanthropy, we started at a very high level. It's now time to get a little bit deeper, more tactical. So let's first talk about the effective ways for Canadians to give to charities. What are those ways to give?
So first and foremost, giving directly to an organization is the best way. And just writing that check, or I'll get into what it means, but directly to the organization, nothing else in the way. Give that money and let them do the work that they want to do. Now, for Canadians that are looking for some more strategy or looking for some more organization, maybe they give to multiple organizations. This is where some of the other things that I talked about in our first conversation around establishing a private foundation, creating a donor advised fund, these things just kind of add a level of sophistication to how somebody is organized around their giving. And, we've talked about those things already a little bit, and there's lots of info on our website. So at the end of the day, give directly or through some sort of a vehicle like the ones I've identified. Then when you think about what is it that you're giving, cash, credit card, check, those are standard. Another way that Canadians should know is the gift of appreciated public securities. The Canadian government added this new element to giving, I guess, about 10 or 15 years ago, maybe a bit longer. And the whole notion is that there's a way now that we can give publicly traded securities where we avoid paying capital gains tax on the increase that we've experienced with the shares that we own. And so the mechanics, we can get into that some other time, and there's lots of real details there. But all to say, it's a real tax advantageous way for folks to give, and particularly comes into play when folks are thinking about larger transactions and larger commitments, maybe a pledge over 5 years, that kind of thing. There's a real multiplier that comes into play for families when they're thinking about some of that planning. So appreciated public securities are a really important way. There's tons of other vehicles as well. Life insurance policies. Sometimes individuals name a charity as the owner and or the beneficiary of a policy. So that's something that somebody can look into. Leaving instructions in your will is a really simple way as well, basically known as a bequest. You can leave a bequest to specific organizations. You can leave a specific amount or a percentage of your estate. So there's lots of different things. I think ultimately, it's folks like and professionals like Steadyhand that are really knowledgeable of their client situation and are going to provide the right feedback and the right ideas of how they can go about doing that planning. I'm not giving any official tax advice or anything like that, but I would just say that there's a lot of different options that Canadians have. Again, depending on their circumstances, they'll figure out what's the right ones for them.
From my own personal experience, we give appreciated Steadyhand fund units to the Toronto Foundation as a way to take advantage of that tax incentive that you mentioned earlier. So let's just say, for the sake of example, I invest $1,000 in the Steadyhand Builders Fund, which is our all equity fund, and it grows to become worth $2,000. And this is in my non-registered account, so my taxable account. I can give all $2,000 worth of those Steadyhand units to the Toronto Foundation, and I pay no capital gains tax because I've gifted those units to the Toronto Foundation. The Toronto Foundation pays no capital gains tax because you're a tax-exempt organization, and you get all $2,000 worth. So it is as you mentioned, that sort of maximizer effect. It's brilliant. I've also, in my wife and our wills, we've created a sort of a 3-part program where we give our kids some money to help them, pay down debts and things like that. And then after that, we've designated 5 charities that are important to us to receive money directly, to your point, of giving money directly to charities. And then the balance goes to our beneficiaries, the kids.
I want to just riff off that for 1 second. So, and I guess this is a bit of a plug for a donor advised fund, not necessarily just mine, but any donor advised fund. One thing that can be really helpful for families when they're thinking about their legacy planning. So in your example, right, like when you name those 5 organizations in your will, one issue that could come up is 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you may change your mind and say, oh, I don't want to give to one of those anymore. Now it's just 4, or I want to add a 6th. Any change you make in your will, you will have to pay for that, right? A codicil is required, and there's a whole process, and people do it. It's a thing. What you could do instead is you could, in your will, simply say, leave X dollars or X percent to my donor advised fund at Community Foundation ABC or wherever it is. And then all of a sudden, that language never needs to change, because then you have a bequest agreement with the provider, us, and you can change that whenever you want, because that is simply just, it's an agreement between you and I. There's no legal binding until you've passed. And so that's something that I think folks often use. It's a way that people use donor advised funds in their estate planning that can really be helpful for them as they think through the life of their estate.
Boom. Of course. We did our will 4 years before we created our fund at the Toronto Foundation. And absolutely, that makes total sense. Totally, we're going to change our will to direct that amount of money, which is a substantial amount of money, to the Toronto Foundation for 2 reasons. One, the simplicity with which you just talked about, but also because, as we talked about in the first video, we have designated our 4 children to be the administrators of that fund. So it just makes sense to keep them engaged, arguably with a larger pot of money after we're gone. So I love it. Now, Neil, you've mentioned volunteering. I'm proud to say that the Toronto Steadyhand team is getting together this week, actually, with several of our clients. We're going to the Toronto Humane Society to see what that operation is all about. And that also includes a very modest gift as well. But let's talk more specifically about the donor-advised funds, which is at the core of how the Toronto Foundation operates. I'm sure there's all sorts of mechanical issues, including the minimum that you have to have, the maximum that you have to give out, and things like that. Can you walk us through some of that?
For sure. And maybe just before that, just on your volunteering, you sort of said it right at the end, but I want to just underscore what you said, because it's important. You mentioned, you're going to be there, you're going to learn about the operation, roll your sleeves up. You mentioned a modest gift as well. And I think it's really important to say that out loud too, right? Because I think it's important for those of us with privilege and means, when we go to places like this and take part in these opportunities, to also give a little bit. We're giving our time, yes, but when we're able to give some money, particularly unrestricted money, because that just helps that organization continue to do the good work that they do. So thanks for sharing that example and what you guys are doing. I think it's really great. With respect to your question, so yeah, there's lots of mechanics when it comes to donor advised funds. Some of the specifics are going to be organization specific. So, I'll share some examples at Toronto Foundation, but I just want to say with a caveat that some numbers and percentages and things will change depending on which organization you're talking to. But I think at a high level, it's helpful just from a orientation perspective. So for us, our minimum to set up a donor advised fund is $10,000. And then we have folks all the way up at, 20 million plus. And so there's obviously quite a range. Our average fund size is about 350 to 400,000. And we have different types of funds. We have endowment funds where the principal is invested and you're only spending out of the interest earned, and the spend is the granting dollars that you're giving to the organizations you care about. And then we also have sort of flow through funds, which are in a way more like a checking account where the money's put in, but it's fully available to be granted out to the charities you care about. Some semantics. A gift in to a donor advised fund is what generates the tax receipt. And then once the money's there and it's granted out, there's no other tax receipt happening because the money's been receipted on the front end. also with donor advised funds, when somebody makes that gift in, that's the transaction, right? So they gave the gift, and now the money, the tax receipt is returned to them, and that's sort of the transaction that's happening. And I say that specifically because when somebody makes a charitable gift, to the Humane Society, the same thing. You give them money and they give you a tax receipt. You can never ask for that money back. Same thing applies with a donor advised fund. The money is now in the donor advised fund, that named after your family or what have you, but it is there. It's no longer your money. And so the money's there. You got tax receipted, you're good. And now the money can be granted to the things you care about. The CRA has a rule that says that all charitable foundations must grant at minimum 5%. That's called the disbursement quota. So that number, each donor advised fund provider uses that number as a way to calculate how they're going to allocate the resources out of your fund. But ultimately, the family are the quote unquote donor advisors, and they make the grant recommendation to the organization. So in our case, Toronto Foundation and our board, we then approve that grant recommendation and send the money on behalf of that family. Something else that's important to think about when it comes to donor advised funds is the idea of privacy. As of now, with donor advised funds, because you are registered at a public foundation, so to have charitable status, you have to be audited every now and then, and your materials are all online. So you and I right now, we could go to the CRA website and we could do a search for kind of any charitable foundation that has registered status, and we would see how much assets they have, who's on their board of directors, where they've given, what their address is, all of that stuff. In Toronto Foundation's case, you see all of that for Toronto Foundation, but you do not see all of that for our fund holders. So we have about 750 individuals and families that have donor advised funds with us, ranging, as I said, from 10,000 to 20 million. Each of those individual funds, you cannot see that level of detail. So so it's interesting, right? Because they're at a public foundation, but they're actually quite private. But when you're a private foundation, you're actually quite public. And so that's sort of the nuance there that I think is important for people to understand as well when it comes to donor advised funds. The last thing I'll say, David, is when you have a donor advised fund, you can grant to any registered Canadian charity. So just because you're at a community foundation in Vancouver or in Toronto or what have you, you're not limited to only granting in that community. You can grant across the country to any registered Canadian charity. And that's really important because so many families are mobile, right? And maybe they grew up in Calgary, they live in Toronto now, they went to school in Montreal. And so there's giving that wants to happen everywhere. That can happen. And so, yeah, just those are some key points about donor advised funds that are, I think, important for your audience.
Let's shift now to the steps that individuals can take to make sure the donations are having the biggest possible impact. In our first video, we talked about some techniques the Toronto Foundation are using to bring charitable organizations that are maybe under the radar forward. But how can people vet charities to ensure that the money is being used effectively? And can you address this sort of ongoing stigma of administrative expenses, which people tend to focus on?
That's a big one. It's there's lots to say here. I think for starters, David, I would say giving to charity is an art and a science. And why I say art and science is because it can't only be about something like the cost revenue ratio, because frankly, like that is just not good enough, I have to say. And let me get into that a little bit more. I think ultimately, when you're talking about, especially at the community level, in that first video, in the first conversation we had, I talked about a very large percentage of money going to a very small percentage of charities. Generally speaking, that small group of charities tends to be very large institutions, and whereas the 99% of organizations that aren't seeing that big deal of money tends to be smaller, grassroots, community-based organizations. And ultimately, right, like organizations at a small size, a $10,000 gift, a $1,000 gift to an organization like that can really change the trajectory of a youth after school program that they're running versus that same gift going to, your alma mater or my alma mater. What I want people to think about when we think about this sort of giving idea is, let's use education as an example. And my comments are going to be specifically here in Toronto. So somebody decides that they want to make a 7-figure gift or an 8-figure gift to, a big institution, an educational institution in our city. For sure, generations of kids thereafter are going to benefit from that money, and lots of good is going to continue at that organization or at that institution from a higher education perspective. But the challenge I have whenever I see a big gift like that is I immediately go way downstream, and I think about the kids growing up in neighborhoods like Scarborough or Regent Park or Rexdale, where for them, even the thought of or knowledge of a higher ed institution in downtown Toronto, like, isn't even on their radar. They don't even know it exists. They don't even think it's a possibility for them. They're not even getting breakfast in some cases. They need help with homework supports. They don't know what STEM is. So you start really connecting those dots, right? And so if a family is making that 7-8 figure gift at that level, I want them thinking about, how do I go way downstream? And how do I take some of that money from up here and actually go down there and say, hey, I'm declaring I care about education. So if that's the case, then I should really be looking at education across the entire spectrum. I can't just be giving up here. I have to go downstream, because otherwise those kids in cities like Toronto and across the country, like, there's just no pathway for them to ever utilize any of those funds. And so that, and you can run that whole example in healthcare. You can look at mental health. You can look at food security. There's, whatever you care about as a viewer of this video, think about your giving when you think about it that way, and think about that ecosystem. I think for me, that is ultimately a really, really, really important way for folks to think about how they can make really good impact.
Talking about this administrative issue, I can't remember the stats, but it seems to me that 8% of a charitable organization's annual budget goes to administration, sort of on average. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just remember hearing some people complain about that. And I thought, well, wait a second. We're talking about investing in capacity building. We're talking about, this is hard work, and like 8%. So I just encourage people to really think more strategically about that rather than sort of complaining about it.
How many people, when you're having client conversations, how many of them are asking, how much does Steadyhand pay on overhead, right? Like, it's just, the narrative is so skewed. And so I think it's just like, I think it's important for folks to understand that, the charitable ecosystem, it's a really important part of our economy, of our GDP, of all those things. And it's a part of being in a community. And so I think ultimately, right, like, people like me, we're not working in this sector for free. We are talented employees that, bring good value. And I think it's part of the entire thing. Like, there was this campaign a few years back. I think some charities were talking about this concept of, like, I'm overhead, and this idea that, like, yeah, that, like, literally I am overhead. But, like, that's, I think we got to go way past that, right? Because it's really about impact. And I think most Canadians, when they're thinking about their giving and thinking about the impact that they want to make, want to do it in a way that that can really help people. And so let me talk a little bit about some of the ways that people can find impact or find organizations. I think in Toronto or Ontario, there's some things that I would recommend people thinking about. So Ontario Trillium Foundation publishes every year the series of organizations that they fund when they do an open call for applications. The United Way, Toronto, and Greater Toronto does the same thing. Toronto Foundation, we have something called our Good to Give Guide, which is essentially like a giving catalog. So there's lots of places, and we can provide links to all these afterwards. There's lots of places where people can go to actually see, some folks, like some of these foundations, have done the heavy lifting. They've done the analysis. They've sort of understood what impact this organization's having. And now they've sort of open source published this stuff for you and I to consume. And then use as a way to sort of make the impact that we're looking to make. And so I think those are some examples of the kinds of resources that exist out there. And, there's hundreds more. Canada Helps would be another one where people can go. And so, yeah, I think it's important for folks, especially those that may not know where to turn. Like there are some really great resources right in front of us.
Fantastic. And you're right. We will link to each and every one of those resources. Now, Neil, just taking this to a very granular level, are you comfortable talking about how the tax system incentivizes Canadians to actually give to charity?
Our tax system in Canada has definitely incentivizes Canadians to give. When I'm at conferences with estate lawyers and tax accountants and whatnot, like continually I hear that Canada has some of the best rules in place for Canadians, especially when it comes to incentivizing charitable giving. So they're two very, very linked features. And in particular for high net worth and ultra high net worth Canadians. I think before I get specific into this conversation, I think the comment I'd like to make as well, and hopefully this doesn't come completely like out of left field or anything, but I think it's important just to say that tax is not a 4-letter word, and tax is important in a country like Canada to sort of give us all the things that we enjoy being in a country like Canada. And, we could all kind of comment or argue about, well, maybe sometimes tax dollars in our perception aren't being used in the most effective way. And so that's a conversation that we can have. But I think a conversation around like avoiding tax or finding ways to not pay it, like that's, for me anyway, not a conversation that I really want to get into. I would say though, from a charitable giving perspective, I think it's really important. And here's why. I think, especially for high net worth and ultra high net worth Canadians, through our planning, we often come across moments of liquidity. So it could be selling a business, it could be an inheritance, it could be, a severance. Any of these things sometimes will trigger, in a particular year, a larger influx of tax. And in situations like that, for me, what they do is they create an opportunity from a charitable giving perspective, and the Canadian government incentivizes this opportunity because of all the features they have in place within the tax system. And so I think what I would say is it's moments of liquidity like that can really connect the dots for philanthropists to really help people kind of go well beyond maybe what they would normally give in a given year. And why I think that's critical is and where I think a vehicle like a donor advised fund can really play in here is for a lot of folks, a vehicle like a donor advised fund can separate the transaction from the inspiration. And I think that's something that's really important to think about for a second, because imagine you're in a scenario where, in 2024, you've sold your business and it's now, the end of the year, the deadline's looming, and you're like, oh my God, my accountant's on me. I have to take care of this. Probably a first call could be to your alma mater. It could be to the church, whatever. And you make this big gift and it's done. And you got your tax receipt and, it's done. The difference could be instead you put some planning in place and you gift to a public foundation and you set up a donor advised fund. So you get your tax receipt, it's done, but it's not done because now you've actually given yourself some time and you've built in this idea of actually thinking about the impact you want to make and the inspiration, who you want to do it with. And all of those things now are really the good part of it, right? And your accountant's happy, has your tax receipt, and that's taken care of. But now let's actually like enjoy this and be a part of it and see where it can go and light up. And so like that for me is a really important feature here and a big part of how to utilize the different offerings of the tax system in the best way possible for the situation that you find yourself in. Is that helpful, David?
Yeah, I think that's really important. It buys you some time to think more strategically about how to have an impact while also taking advantage of the tax incentives that come from gifting in the fiscal period that is relevant for you. So I think that's absolutely brilliant. Now, as we wrap up here, Anil, A lot of Canadians are going to want to get more involved in organizations like the Toronto Foundation after hearing your inspiring words. So how do they go about doing that?
First and foremost, so I said earlier, there's over 200 community foundations across the country, and so find your local community foundation first and foremost is what I would suggest. And if you have trouble doing that, reach out to me, and I will gladly make that connection for you. We are peers, across the country, big cities, Vancouver, Edmonton, Winnipeg, us, but then lots of smaller communities as well. In fact, the newest community foundation is in Iqaluit in the north. And so there's 207 community foundations across the country right now. And why I suggest that is because your local community foundation is a perfect local place to start, because they have their eyes on what's happening in your local community. And most probably for most Canadians, there is a sort of a bias to want to help your local community, not exclusively, but it's a place to start. And so that's something, David, I would highly recommend. I think as well, I referenced a bunch of different resources, like things like foundations and their giving lists. Mine were primarily in Toronto, but organizations and foundations like that exist across the country. And community foundations often have links to many of those resources too. And I would just take it back to base level as well. Like, I really want people just really thinking very locally, right? So like, if you've got kids, how might you get involved in your kid's school? Or is your kid in an extracurricular? And how might you get involved in coaching or being a part of an art program? What's the need locally in terms of, food and food insecurity? Is that something that is of need? The stats right now are shocking in terms of how many people are utilizing food banks in this country. And it's not just who it used to be, right? Like there's a lot of folks who are working, nurses, teachers, who just, could use a little hand once in a while, and it's there for them. And so the need is really great. And I think it shouldn't take most of us very long to look around and see, like, holy, like I think I can help, and I want to help. And so I think it starts there, and then things like giving and whatnot, like, it all comes out of that. And of course, there's situations where there's something a bit more complex, and then specialists like you and I and others can come into play. But ultimately, at the base level, like, I think it's about really being a really committed and caring part of the community.
I think those are incredibly wise and relevant words. Charity starts at home and in your home community, so it makes sense to look at your local community that way. And so we'll provide links to all of the resources that you refer to, so that people can reach out, find where to have an impact first locally, and then more broadly if they want to do that. I know you're active on LinkedIn, so we'll also include a link to your LinkedIn profile. If anybody wants to reach out to you, they can do that through LinkedIn, or perhaps just send you an email directly.
Sure thing.
Anil, you've been incredibly great and generous with your time and your perspectives. Thanks for joining us on the Steadyhand Coffee Break.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. And if you haven't yet had a chance to subscribe to the Steadyhand YouTube channel, we encourage you to do that and ask to be notified whenever we load up new content. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.